power of attorney. Regardless of your immigration and legal status, if you are on U.S. soil, you have a right to sign over power of attorney privileges for your health and finances to another individual. I'm taking the time to tell you guys all of this today because if you're a member of this church, chances are you care for and love an immigrant, or you know somebody who cares and loves for an immigrant. And while these are all rights and laws and they are all protected, ICE officers and other law enforcement officers don't have to make sure you know your rights. They don't even have to ensure that your rights are being protected, which can get really tricky, especially when you add in things like cultural differences and a thick language barrier. So our staff has been around the community, presenting to schools and churches and partner organizations and employers, teaching them this information and how to navigate interactions with ICE officers. And then what are we preparing for? Everybody has their theories, ideas of what's coming in the Trump administration. Immigration attorneys have no business or habit in predicting changes to immigration law. If we made that our business, we would close our doors in a day. We can't make any predictions, but these are the three things that we are actively putting resources towards right now. We are anticipating a loss of over $500,000 in grant funding. Unique challenge to lose a lot of funding, but also get a lot more work. Thankfully, we have an awesome advancement director and committee, and they're doing a great job. We are expecting and preparing for mass deportations and employer raids. Think like Bush era employer raids. They have happened in West Michigan before, unfortunately, and there is a reasonable chance that they could happen again. So we're also preparing employers and communities for what to do in the event that an ICE officer or team were to show up at your place of employment. And then ultimately changes to USCIS operations. So USCIS stands for the United States Customs and Immigration Service. They process green cards, visas, all of the immigration applications and documents, and we're anticipating that those processes are going to drastically slow down or become heavily restricted. That is kind of my little spiel on what we're doing for election results. If you have questions, definitely please let me know. But before we jump into community navigators, I want to take you guys back to basics because there's three words that people have a tendency to use interchangeably, and that's asylee, refugee, and immigrant. And so I wanted to break those down for you today because I'm going to be talking about these different words. So first of all, an asylum seeker is somebody fleeing persecution from their home country. This is usually what we think of when we think of somebody seeking asylum or a refugee. They have applied for or are planning to apply for asylum in the country, and they can apply for a work permit 6 months after just submitting their application. So it doesn't even actually matter if their asylum application is approved. Right now, asylum applications stay in process for like 3 to 5 years. So getting a work permit after 6 months allows people to be able to work and have some sort of legal status while they're waiting for their asylum application to be approved. An asylee is somebody who was an asylum seeker and then was granted their status 3 to 9 years after arrival to the US and submitting their application. As soon as that asylum application is approved, they're authorized to work immediately. And these folks are also fleeing persecution from their home country. I'm sure you're all familiar with the influx of Afghans that we saw 2 years ago. They would be qualified as asylees because they did not apply for asylum until they landed in the United States. Refugee is somebody, the difference between an asylee and a refugee is somebody who is granted legal status immediately upon arrival to the US, meaning that they were processed by the UNHCR and the United States government before they arrived on US soil. So as soon as they get here, they are able to work, do all of the things. They can get public benefits. They can petition family members from their home country. But the biggest difference between asylee and refugee is where they apply for status. And then lastly is immigrant. The official definition of an immigrant is a person who moves from one country to another with the intention of living there permanently or for an extended period of time. I studied abroad in college. I was not an immigrant, right? I had no intention of living there permanently or staying there for a very long time. A dear friend of mine said, oh, I just loved immigrating here to Jordan. And I said, well, I don't know that that's what we can call it, right? A general rule of thumb, and I recognize this isn't showing up well, so I'm going to read it to you. Nearly all asylum seekers, refugees, and asylees are immigrants, but not all immigrants are refugees, asylees, and asylum seekers. There's lots of reasons why immigrants may come to this country, lots of different pathways. And just because you're an immigrant doesn't automatically mean you were fleeing persecution from your home country. Our dear staff attorney, Bill, made me add the nearly all because he likes to find things that cannot make sense. And his example of not somebody who would qualify as an asylum seeker, refugee, as asylee, if you think of like somebody from Palestine who ended up on the border of Jordan and had to stay in Jordan because they couldn't go home, you probably would ask that Palestinian, do you want to be here? And they say, no, I have no intention of living here long-term or permanently, right? That's kind of the exclusionary clause. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the history of refugee resettlement here in the United States. And when I say refugee resettlement, I am referring to refugees who gained status outside of the US, as well as asylum seekers and people with asylee status here. So I'm using that colloquial refugee term for you today. So refugee resettlement started a long time ago, primarily by voluntary organizations such as religious groups and churches. Mutual aid societies like the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society was one of the very first ones. Bethany Christian Services is a good example of a volunteer organization. They weren't operating back then doing refugee stuff, but today. The US was always receiving people fleeing religious, political, and ethnic persecution, but immigration policies early on, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act and the 1924 Immigration Act, set really, really strict and harsh quotas that were really discriminatory based on race, limiting who could enter. When I was growing up and learned about the Holocaust and about Nazi Germany, we always learned about it in extreme reverence, right? I learned about it as one of the greatest tragedies in our recent human history, as I think we would all agree it was. But when it was happening, there was a lot of anti-Semitic sentiment here in the United States, and many Americans did not want Jewish refugees to settle here. And you may have heard the story that in 1939, the US actually turned away the MS St. Louis, which was a ship carrying nearly 1,000 Jewish refugees. And so when I often talk to people today who are horrified by the fact that there's people out there who don't understand why immigrants and refugees should be able to come here and have a right to stability and safety. But that's always been the case, right? We were debating it during the Holocaust, of all things. Of course, we're debating it now. Ultimately, World War II shifted public awareness about refugees, but the US government still remained really reluctant to act. Thankfully, in 1948, the Displaced Persons Act was created in response to the post-war refugee crisis. And it was kind of the first major refugee legislation that the United States saw. We still, though, favored certain immigrants over others, right? We didn't want Jewish immigrants or African immigrants, right? The legislation was really deeply influenced by Cold War geopolitics, and so priority was given to refugees from Eastern Europe who fled communist regimes. And this favoritism excluded Jewish refugees and others who didn't fit that preferred profile. So we're still experiencing this discrimination against individuals, right? And then comes the Refugee Act of 1980. We consider this to be kind of the cornerstone of refugee policy in US history. It was enacted in response to inconsistent practices in refugee admissions during the Cold War, which prioritized Eastern Europeans and European immigrants. And it actually created the definition of refugee we use today, which is an individual with a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. And that fifth one is the broad one that a lot of people can find status through. It also established the Office of Refugee Resettlement, otherwise known as ORR. ORR is the entity that gives dollars to places like Bethany Christian Services, Samaritas, Church World Service, Catholic Charities to carry out federal resettlement services. The Refugee Act also, and most importantly, created an annual cap on refugee admissions, initially set at 50,000 per year. If you didn't know this, the United States always has a cap on how many refugees can be admitted. And the very first one was 50,000. And after the 1980s, we saw more inclusivity in the refugees that we were accepting, folks from Southeast Asia, the former Soviet Union, refugees fleeing ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Kosovo, as well as Africa. The annual refugee cap post-1980s varied, but steadily remained between 70 and 120,000 annually, depending on who was in office. And recently, we've continued to be one of the largest refugee resettlement countries in the entire world, especially in the 2010s when the war in Syria created millions of Syrian refugees. Something to note is that between 2017 and 2021, the Trump administration drastically reduced the annual refugee cap to 15,000 per year. It went from 110,000 to 15, the lowest it had ever been in United States history. Thankfully, when the Biden administration came into office, he increased the refugee ceiling to 125,000 for the fiscal year of 2022, and created wonderful programs like Operation Allies Rescue and Operation Allies Welcome for our Afghan friends who needed support during that time. But one of the things that Lighthouse is preparing for is for that cap to drastically drop again, which would be terribly sad and has an incredibly negative impact on our community. And as some of you may know, if you've worked with immigrants and refugees or Afghans before, the road to stability is really, really long, right? First barrier that a family seeking refuge or asylum might find is eligibility requirements, right? Government programs like those that happen at Bethany Christian Services and Samaritas and Church World Service have very strict eligibility requirements. I have met Afghans who don't qualify for resettlement services because they arrived in the United States one day after the cutoff period. Same circumstances, right? They're in the exact same boat, maybe even flew on the same aircrafts, but were processed just a day later. And so they don't qualify and are not eligible for services. And so many immigrants fall outside of those margins. Second really big barrier is if you become eligible and if you can access those services, many government programs are designed to be temporary, providing immediate relief assistance that only lasts 30 to 180 days. 180 days is that 6-month period. So if somebody gets on US soil and submits their asylum application the very day they arrive, which most cannot because they are huge applications, you don't even have your work permit yet before your resettlement assistance ends. And then there's, of course, the lack of social capital, right? Sure, you're enrolled in a government assistance program, but they're managed by caseworkers who are also restricted by their own availability and resources. Your case manager is going to be there for you, but they're not going to be there for you if your car breaks down at 7 o'clock at night and you need somebody to call, right? And there's a really big lack of flexibility that doesn't allow clients to get the time-sensitive support that they need. And the fourth one is it's a really complicated system. Governments and nonprofits work together to provide a lot of these essential services, but navigating the different institutions is complicated, overwhelming, and really time-consuming. Here in West Michigan alone, I've worked with clients who are receiving services from, one client receiving services from Bethany Christian Services, Lighthouse Immigrant Advocates, Community Action House, Latin Americans United for Progress, and Zealand Adult Education. All essential services that they need to survive here, but 5 different organizations that operate in 5 completely different ways, some of which don't operate in Spanish at all whatsoever. For somebody who just arrived here, it can become impossible. I've lived here my whole life, and I'm still learning about nonprofits that I didn't know existed. Imagine what it's like to land here and not be able to speak the language or have any friends, right? And so we create this gap, right? There's this gap between federal services and stability. And these things that you see listed here are the folks that don't qualify and are ineligible for federal services. So that's asylum seekers, right? Until you've been granted asylum or refugee status, sorry, you don't get help from the government. Cubans and Haitians who entered through the CHEP program, even though they do have a status, they don't qualify for resettlement services. Secondary migrants, so we often see clients who immigrate, so say you have a client from Venezuela, they first immigrated to Colombia, right? Okay, got out of their bad situation, but Colombia is not much better, so they came to the United States. Well, the US will argue if you have status in Colombia, you don't really need to come here, right? Temporary visa holders, so individuals who have humanitarian parole or temporary protected status, which they often have before they become asylees or refugees. Undocumented immigrants, right? Common misconception is that all undocumented immigrants are undocumented, when in reality, so many immigrants have applications and have submitted all of the paperwork and have done all of the right things, and they're just waiting, right? They're just in limbo. And so folks who are just waiting. And then, as I mentioned about that Afghan client we had who arrived just one day later, non-OAR and OAW Afghans, right? Same with Ukrainians or individuals who have fled huge catastrophic events around the world, but just barely missed the deadline. Of course, in this group, you also have people who came on employment visas and diversity visas, migrant farm workers. If you can guess, the United States in 2023, in our 2023 census, we had 46.6 million was the estimated number of both documented and undocumented immigrants in the United States. Of those, the amount that qualify for federal services that are just eligible, not even using them, but are eligible, is 3%. Very, very low. It's absolutely not okay. It's not cool at all. Granted, there's a big chunk of those who don't need them, right? Because they came with families here, immigrated from more stable situations, but so many do. And our federal services, even though they are good and even though they are robust, it's good they exist, they're not doing enough. We need a bridge for this gap. And words really matter when we talk about this, right? When I read about the Middle East refugee crisis, I hear things like this, right? So much empathy for Afghans, for Ukrainians. When I was living in Jordan, so much empathy for Palestinians, right? But then we talk about what's happening in the southern border, right? And we lose that empathy and that sympathy for immigrants from Central and South America, right? Saying things like we're being invaded. And it's easy to think that, well, words are just words and it's just the media and it doesn't matter, but it does matter. It highly informs policy, and especially when it comes to federal eligibility requirements, who is in office and the administration that we have and the people we have in our government, our congressmen, they can influence those very strict, very small changes in eligibility requirements. And so words absolutely matter and influence who gets those federal services, right? And so that kind of brings us to the question, why do we need community navigators? There's already resettlement programs out there, right? I hope that harrowing 4% number of people who qualify told you enough that we need something, right? And that's where community navigators comes in. You have pamphlets. I see in most of your hands. You're welcome to read them now, but I'm going to cover everything in them. So the biggest reason why we need another resettlement program is that many federally funded programs have strict eligibility requirements. If you are an organization and you want to offer resettlement services and you accept a single dollar from the US government, you get hit with hundreds of pages of rules and eligibility requirements for the folks that you are serving. Community Navigators at Lighthouse doesn't accept a single dollar intentionally so that we are not bound by the same strict rules and eligibility requirements of the US government. Also social capital, right? I talked about case managers, and while they are so wonderful, and my best friend is one, they don't have the flexibility that our clients need, and they can't do everything, and they can't be everything, right? And so we need more social capital in order for them to thrive and to stay here. I can't imagine my life without my friends. Like, can you imagine if you woke up tomorrow morning and your friends weren't there anymore, your family wasn't there, right? How lonely that would feel. We need social capital to successfully build stable lives. We anticipate a continued influx of immigrant and refugees in need of resettlement services here in West Michigan. Few reasons for that. One, Bethany Christian Services resettlement contract in Grand Rapids was not renewed. And so there's a lot of folks who will not be receiving resettlement services through Bethany anymore. Also, even though there are lots of big threats incoming from the Trump administration about walls and restrictions and deportations, we don't have any reason to believe that that is actually going to realistically slow down the amount of people that come into the country. As we know, walls are actually pretty ineffective at keeping people out. And so we still anticipate a continued influx, as well as because of that 15,000 refugees a year cap that I mentioned, right? We're still going to see the same amount of people who have need, right? Just the amount who are legally here and meet those eligibility requirements is going to go way down. And then lastly, for intercultural exchange, West Michigan is rich in its diversity. I grew up in Zeeland, downtown Zeeland, and for most of my life, I lived in a completely white world. The only kids at my church were adopted from Ethiopia. I went to Christian school where the only children of color were also adopted from Ethiopia. And that is the amount of diversity that I had in my bubble at the time. But West Michigan is diverse, which I know you all know well. And Community Navigators intentionally pairs individuals from different backgrounds together to increase our region's cultural agility and understanding of one another. My love for immigrants and refugees and people from different cultures started with my teachers. I went into a Spanish immersion program as a kid. All of my teachers were from Central and South America. And it was my relationships with them that helped build that empathy from the start, right? Knowing one another is the greatest way to understand one another. And Community Navigators hopes to do that. And so that's where the bridge comes in. That's how we're hoping to build the bridge. So any immigrant who resides in Ottawa or Allegan County is 18 years or older, is from Central or South America, a current or past client of Lighthouse Immigrant Advocates, has been in the US for 2 years or less, and is not receiving federal resettlement services, can participate in the Community Navigators program. And you might read this and be like, Leah, you replace government eligibility requirements with your own. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? But the amount of people who actually fit into this group is a ton. And often the folks who fit into it are exactly the ones who don't fit into federal resettlement eligibility requirements. But the other great thing about Community Navigators is that we are an independent organization of just a few folks, which means that we can change the rules and we can make exceptions, and we can do things like when we find out that there's going to be 300 plus Afghans settling in West Michigan, completely pivot the way we do our programming. We're not bound by those rigid federal structures. And I like to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs when I talk about Community Navigators. And I'm going to tell you a story, and I hope you'll bear with me for a minute. A few months ago, I had to go to a doctor's appointment 30 minutes away from my house, and I had to get a little procedure done, so I had to have somebody drive me. I was telling my friend about my problem. The procedure was at like 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. I didn't know who could take me. And before I even finished my sentence, he said, I'm going to take you, Leah. He picked me up. He took me to my appointment, and we even grabbed dinner on our way home. And you're probably thinking, Leah, that's what friends are for, right? I do that all the time. You probably are going to do that this week. And you're right. That's exactly what friends in our community is for. When our cars break down, when those life hiccups happen, we need somebody to watch our kids last minute, our basement floods. It's our family and our friends and our coworkers, our our pastors who show up to support us. When I asked my friend for a ride, he didn't tell me to go get a bus card or enroll in a transportation assistance program, right? Which he could have done. He just showed up in the same way that we all show up for the people that we care about. But as you know, immigrants and refugees who are arriving in the United States, they're not afforded that social capital. They don't have the capacity to do this. There's no friends and family who could show up for them, even if they wanted to. I talk to immigrants every single week who are burdened with this despair of not having community, not having friends or family that they can lean on. It's the hardest part, I think. And many arrive without knowing a single person. This means that during their first years here in the US, simple things like a routine medical appointment, maybe your car breaks down, they can be impossible to resolve and devastating if left unaddressed. And despite escaping violence of places like Afghanistan, refugees arriving here in the United States are set to face a new yet hauntingly similar set of challenges. Limited resources, too many obstacles to get them, and having to do it all alone. That's just wrong, right? And it doesn't have to be that way. Preliminary research coming out of New Zealand, who is also following a community-based model, participating refugees identified that initial support from their local neighbors, friends, and faith partners as the key and foundational factors in their ability to become self-sufficient in their communities. That's pretty incredible, right? Not their work permit, not their car, not their house, their friends, their family, the people who volunteered to walk alongside them. And I know, just as well as any of you know, that there's not a single program in the world that can replace the power of friendship and community, right? But community-based refugee resettlement, like that of Community Navigators, tries to harness the power of community, right? And magnify the quantity and quality and accessibility of the services that are already existing in our community. And so we can take what federal services provide, right? Safety needs, physiological needs, health, all good things, we need them. But we can give them everything. Community-based resettlement offers us an opportunity to go all the way up the hierarchy. And we don't call it Maslow's hierarchy of wants, right? It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need all 5 in order to survive and to thrive in our communities. And I think that's what really differs. That's what's really unique about the Community Navigators program. It doesn't stop at giving out resources. The idea is not to drain and take from our volunteers and the existing resources in our community, but by building lasting connections between immigrants and their communities, our newest neighbors develop the social capital that they need to succeed long-term, making them self-sufficient and able to give back to their communities eventually. And I think that's really the beauty of it, right? Is we're not just focused on meeting these 2 immediate needs, but empowering people to become long-standing members of our community and to help others thrive as well. And so how does it work? Right? So you're like, Leah, this is a great program, and I still have no idea what you're talking about. Well, I'm going to tell you that right now. It starts with a referral. So every day we see dozens of immigrants and clients in our office at Lighthouse. And a staff member knows that when they meet a client that hits those eligibility requirements, which are also listed in your pamphlet, to let me know. They send me a little message and they say, Leah, I think I have somebody. They're new to the area, they're from Central South America, and they need community. They need some resettlement support. So let me know. And I give that client a call and I say, hi, my name is Leah. I give them my whole spiel, right? And make sure that they really do, in fact, meet those requirements that we set forth. If they do, then we go ahead and schedule a 2-hour-long intake. It is a very long, very tiring meeting with myself and some of our wonderful social work interns. And we try to get to know that client from head to toe. What has their journey been like? Why did they make the decision to come to the United States? How long have they been here? How much English do they know? What are their hobbies? Do they practice any sort of faith, right? Who do they know in the area? What did they used to do for employment? How much education do they have, right? Try to get a full picture snapshot of who are our newest neighbors here. And then that neighbor in that very meeting gets to identify 3 to 5 resettlement goals that they would like support with from a community volunteer. And that's also a unique part of the program. If you've done resettlement work with Afghans through programs like Bethany Christian Services and Samaritas, you might understand that it kind of never ends, which isn't a bad thing, right? I have several wonderful Afghan friends and I can't imagine life without them, so I hope it never ends. But the idea with community navigators is that it does end and that we set very clear expectations in the form of goals that the client themselves get to choose. This is completely focused and centered around what the client believes they need and what they want for themselves. But I'll get to review it with them. And within those goals, we pick things that the client is going to take responsibility for doing and things that their volunteer is going to do. A few months ago, I had a community member call me and send a very angry message saying, I thought you guys were a nonprofit. Why do you charge client fees for your services, right? Well, because we believe that every client needs to be invested in their legal case in the same way that we're invested in their legal case, right? And it's the same thing with community navigators. Yes, we are going to provide you with resettlement services, and you're going to be invested in this journey as well. And then we have pairing. So once I've gotten to know the client and we've set out their resettlement goals, I put together a 3 to 5 page summary of who they are, and I email that PDF to Linda Jacobs. Every single church that we partner with for this program has an identified navigator coordinator here at Third Church, that's Linda. And so I email her that PDF and I say, hey, I've got this new neighbor here. This is who they are. This is where they're from. And this is what they need. Do you know of anybody in your church who would be willing to walk alongside these folks during their first year of resettlement? And Linda and I work together to pick out volunteers and members of your church who are best fit and compatible with our new neighbors to commit to walk alongside them. And you may have heard me say 1 year, and I mean it. The idea is that all 3 to 5 of these resettlement goals can be met within 12 months. It takes way more than a year to resettle successfully here in the United States. If you've met an immigrant, you know that. But it is still, that 1 year period is still significantly longer than a lot of existing programs. And so we ask our clients and our church volunteers to make a 1 year long commitment. It is completely voluntary though. And at any time, if our new neighbor says, you know what, I think I've got it from here, thanks so much, I'm gonna be done with the program, they can be, right? We're here to support our new neighbors, not try to enforce our expectations onto them, right? We really let them sit in the driver's seat for it. And so I'm a visual person, so if you are as well, I hope this will help. So we already know who our new neighbors are. That's the word we like to describe our clients, right? They live in Ottawa County, they've been here less than 2 years, they're seeking resettlement assistance, and they're from Central and South America. If you've read your pamphlet, you may also see that one option is also if somebody if their head of household has been deported or detained in the last 12 months, that's something that we're adding to the program, recognizing we're likely going to see a lot of deportation coming in the next 4 years. The immediate circle that wraps around our new neighbors is our community navigators. They directly support our new neighbors. They are the folks who work with them on a day-to-day basis. They help them navigate assisting existing community resources, doing other things like assisting with transportation, offering cultural and local orientation, helping them prepare for job interviews and format a resume, right? All simple, seemingly simple things that become very hard. Supporting our community navigators is our navigator coordinator, Linda. Linda recruits everybody, all of our navigators here within the church. I know I have one or a few in the room currently. Linda and I speak often. We coordinate about the program together and work very closely to make sure that it's successful. She supports community navigators, right? The health of our volunteers is very important as well, resolving conflict, answering any questions from the navigators, and leading team meetings. I think if you've worked in some resettlement before, you know it's important to be in constant communication with the other people doing it. A very dear friend of mine does some resettlement work for an Afghan family, and their team likes to communicate via email. And every single time after they've interacted with the client, they send a long group email to everybody else. I would hate that. That would give me like a heart attack. I cannot imagine getting that many emails, but for some people that works. And that's why Community Navigators is cool for churches and why we have a navigator coordinator, so you guys can decide what works best for you, whether that's meeting through Zoom or coming in person or going to somebody's house for dinner, sending messages via text or via email. There's a lot of flexibility in that. And then around all of it is Lighthouse Immigrant Advocates staff. So in my capacity, I manage and oversee the program. We update program guidelines and process any grievances and feedback. Both community navigators and new neighbors are able to write in a grievance or make a report at any time if they're not having a good experience in the program. I specifically meet with the new neighbors roughly every 90 days during their duration in the program. And so even though the community navigators are providing those day-to-day and weekly kind of touch point and loose case management services, I'm still meeting with the new neighbors on a very regular basis and talking to them regularly. And then I get to coordinate with Linda for all of the wonderful implementation of the program. And that's kind of how Community Navigators works. The commitment that we ask for from our community navigators is 2 to 10 hours a week, roughly. We enrolled our first new neighbors here in Third's Community Navigators program 3 or 4 weeks ago. And Roger is one of their community. I'm going to put you on the spot, Roger. I don't know if you'd say you've done 2 to 10 hours per week. 2-ish, around there? Yeah, it fluctuates, right? If you worked with immigrants or done resettlement, you might know that, right? That some weeks there's a lot going on and other weeks there's none. But we ask for a 2 to 10 hour commitment a week. And we also ask for a commitment of a year, right? Just so that our new neighbors have the stability they need and can build those close, trusting relationships and rapport with you. And that's kind of it. And I am like so proud of myself because I have 5 minutes to spare, which leaves me time for Linda to come up here and chat a little bit about how you can get involved with the work Lighthouse is doing. Before we talk about specifically what if you're like, wow, that sounds really cool, I want to be a community navigator, I'll let Linda kind of talk about that process. But other ways you can support Lighthouse during this time, volunteering in our office. We have some regular volunteers who like to come in once a week for a few hours and do specific volunteer work and jobs. If you are looking for a way to stay busy during this winter, we'd love to have you. We love having our volunteers. They are part of our LIA family and our team, and you do not have to speak Spanish. So if you'd like to volunteer, please let us know. On Saturday, February 15th, we are doing as our marketing team decided, a Spread the Love community canvassing event. So as I mentioned, we're making a lot of efforts to try to get Know Your Rights information into the community. And on that Saturday, our LIA staff and anybody in the community who's interested is going to go door to door, dropping off Know Your Rights mailers around our community. If you've ever canvassed before for like a political organization, it's going to be a lot like that. There'll be food. It'll be really fun. We'd love to have you join as well. And then, of course, I always have to add, you may donate as well. We have Venmo. I think the QR code is to our website. But yeah, we'd love to have you get involved. I have sign-up sheets for canvassing, and if you're interested in becoming a community navigator, as well as for joining our newsletter. After inauguration, our team is going to be working hard to include in our newsletters our interpretation of policy updates and changes. And so if you're looking for an avenue to understand changes to immigration law, I highly recommend signing up for the newsletter. Even like well-meaning media and journalists can get immigration law wrong. And so our attorneys work really hard to take complicated immigration policy and explain to both our clients and our community what the actual repercussions are going to look like here in West Michigan. So if you'd like to be receiving those updates, please leave your name and email, and I'd love to get that to you. So before I take questions, I wanted to turn it over to Linda so that she could talk a little bit about what it looks like to be onboarded for community navigators. You can just stand really close to me. We're always like this.
I think you would agree with me that
Oh, it's on now.
I think you would all agree that Leah is a remarkable woman who brings great passion and knowledge to this work. And so I think we should give her a hand. It has been a delight to work with Leah and the staff at Lighthouse. They've been an incredible resource to us. Of course, at Third, doing this work is not new, but they have brought an incredible amount of resources and tools and just guidance on how to do this well. And so we just want to say thank you to you and to Lighthouse. So if you're interested in how to get involved, as Leah mentioned, we have already started the program here we had some training in November. There is training provided. You may want to know about that. Leah does put together a great training program for anyone who wants to be a navigator. So you go in with all of the expectations and all of those things very clear. As you can see, Leah and the people that she works with are attorneys, so everything is very clear, that everything is very legal. But I think that we already have about 17 people here at Third who have gone through the training and are in various stages of being involved in this. We have already our first family that we've been paired with. And so that team is, and I do want to stress as well that you're on a team. And so there would be at least one other navigator working as a team with a family. So you're not out there on your own. So I think that that's also a best practice that I see in this program. So I don't want to cut into too much time. Please sign up if you would like me to contact you and talk more about what that might look like to do this work. And I know there's some training upcoming in January. There are some other churches that are going to be joining this work. So there's some trainings that are coming up in the next few months that you can join in with other churches as well who are interested in doing this. So I want to leave time for questions. If you have questions about how to get involved or just generally about refugee resettlement or immigration or some of the things that are happening in our country right now, we're going to open it up. So I have a mic here. So anyone have a question? Oh, Lori has one. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. You need anything?
No, I think I'm good.
Realizing the severity of the problem that could be existing fairly soon, has there been any consideration to providing, for instance, if this church became a sanctuary, like a sanctuary city, has that been discussed at all?
It's certainly been discussed. Absolutely. There's been several churches and individuals who've approached Lighthouse about organizing some of those things. It is to become a sanctuary center, a warming shelter, is very, very involved process. And right now, way back when in 2017, during the first Trump administration, Lighthouse partnered with churches who were doing that to try to help get those things up and running. Recognized during that time that was not our area of expertise, and we will not be taking that on this time around, just because it is a very heavily involved process, and it's not as simple as just posting a sign saying, come on in. For example, I have had a lot of churches reach out about implementing community navigators and getting creative about in those moments when things do get really tense and tough. What can we do to be best equipped? And I think this has been a really good starting point. Yes, there's been conversations, and how they have kind of rounded out outside of Lighthouse, I'm not sure. As we've kind of said, we're going to leave that to the individual entity. I've had churches ask, should we create like pipelines to get people to Canada? And I say, I don't think you want to dabble in human trafficking. That doesn't sound like a good idea, right? There's a lot of there's a lot of really good intentions behind those things, but also a lot of legalese that happens behind the scenes that we won't be taking on this administration. Great question.
I can understand that the origin of the law is to support those experiencing political persecution, recognizing also that many come for economic rather than political reasons, which I completely support. How does one go about demonstrating that one is persecuted?
That is such a good question. If we go back to our rules, I'm not an attorney, but it sounds like, and I'm just going to put words in your mouth, it sounds like you're asking, Leah, I'd love to speak to a beautiful Department of Justice accredited representative who works in asylum law with a bunch of refugees and people seeking asylum, but I don't know where to find one. You have one in your congregation. Grace McConaughey, does anybody know her? Okay, good. She works for Lighthouse and could absolutely answer that question much more eloquently than I can. I'll give you a taste of what her answer might be, but please ask her because she would be delighted. She would be delighted. I've sat in on an asylum hearing before and demonstrating before a judge and an ICE prosecutor that you undeniably have been persecuted is heavily involved, right? It can include things like screenshots of text messages, social media posts, affidavits proving that a threat that you received did actually happen, right? Documented evidence of the persecution has to be shown in court to kind of briefly answer that question. It's very, very involved. And the ICE prosecutor will poke holes in your story of persecution. So, yeah. I can hear you, but
All right. Do you anticipate the Trump administration or any of those people making policies or asking any additional things of the police or teachers, the schools, doctors, or pastors to be reporters? And if they do not do you anticipate that being asked of people that help people? I don't know. Yeah.
Good question. I have not heard anything of the sort, both in casual conversation around our office, nor any kind of more official conversations that happen in the realm of immigration law. We've heard conversations about right now, like schools and churches are designated safe spaces. That is likely to become revoked very soon. That likely won't be the case moving forward. But I have not heard anything about additional members of the community having mandated reporting requirements for encountering individuals who are undocumented or without status. Could somebody? Absolutely. Do they? Yes. Are they going to be required to? I've not heard anything of the sort, but that is also a good question for an immigration attorney. Sorry, I'm going to say that a lot.
Leah, thank you so much for a very informative program. And I'm interested in knowing what kind of sidewalls you put on situations where a relationship with the liaison becomes more than intended.
Good question. I knew you guys were going to ask me good questions. That's such a good one. So as Linda mentioned, we come We work in a legal office, and I used to work in immigration foster care. And so every single person who participates in the program has to sign a 13-page detailed agreement of all of the rules and expectations and guidelines, which go beyond just logistical things about participation requirements, but include relational things, right? Some of those are like, you cannot live with your community navigator or crash on their couch. You cannot have any intimate relationship with your community navigator during your duration of the program. And there's even things about like, what does it mean to show respect to one another, right? In programs like this, when there's a lot of cultural differences, we like to be crystal clear about what respect looks like, right? Communicating within reasonable daytime hours and not sending messages at midnight. Planning outings at least 48 hours in advance and not calling somebody last minute and saying, hey, I was hoping to run to the store. Can you come pick me up right now? Right? So part of the beauty of those agreements is that if there's anybody who's ever in violation of the agreement, right, whether intentionally or otherwise, they get a meeting with me and I say, hey, you signed an agreement and now you're not following it. You're not upholding your end of the agreement. So unfortunately, the consequence is up to termination of participating in the program for everybody, for me, for Linda, for community navigators, and for new neighbors. Everybody is held by the exact same standards, which is cool for maintaining a equality and putting everybody on the same level as well. Did that answer your question?
I just want to push a little further on rights and responsibilities.
Do it.
So it's my understanding that currently
Yes.
school systems can refuse to give any information out on any of their students or families.
I just went to a school Know Your Rights presentation. I believe the answer is yes. I'm not an attorney. I believe that is what the attorneys did say, though. Yes.
And can that, again, I know you're not an attorney.
Thank you.
But can you anticipate or might that be changed?
I think that's unlikely that it will be changed. So to answer your question, how about I tell you what we're telling schools to do? Can I take that pathway? Please. Okay. What we're telling schools to do is ICE officers, the training that ICE officers get is very varied. You can have ICE officers who are trained to the level of seasoned police officers who understand the law, understand rights. You can also have ICE officers who are not. And what that means is that any ICE officer who walks into a school or a church, you really don't know what they're going to know is right or not, what's illegal or not. What schools can do is ICE officers cannot go beyond any point that says staff permitted only beyond this point. Same thing for churches, same thing for employers. And so what we're doing is we're walking through schools and employers and telling them what doors to put those signs on so that ICE officers can't get into any area where there might be students. That is kind of the most tangible thing that we're telling students to do and or schools to do, and we're encouraging schools to create emergency action plans so that if an ICE officer were to show up at school, that everybody from the superintendent to the admin assistant and receptionist at the front desk knows exactly what needs to happen. Typically, what would happen is if an ICE officer were to show up at a school with a good emergency plan, the superintendent would be called, the school's legal representation would be called down to where the ICE officer is before they're even allowed to move any further into the building. But having those signs saying authorized personnel or staff only beyond this point is all it takes. Yeah. All right.
Could you share with us your perspective on the relationship with the Holland Police Department and the kind of questions that are being asked? That would be one place.
Sure.
One place we would expect a crackdown to start with would be requesting ICE requesting extended cooperation from the Holland Police Department. What's your understanding of their stance?
Good question. Sarah Jorvan Oosterhout, our founder and managing attorney, has long maintained a positive relationship with the head of our Holland Police Department. I've had the privilege of getting to meet him and several of their kind of high-level officers and patrolmen, and they've all been very wonderful in the interactions that we've had. I won't take the liberty of speaking to our organization's perspective on the Holland Police Department. I think I would get in trouble for that. Partially because I'm not the person to answer that question. One thing that I will say is it's any person in our community, whether they are your neighbor or a police officer, if they come across somebody who is undocumented, have the ability to pick up the phone and call ICE. They have the ability to do that. They can do that. Do we anticipate that that might become more frequent? Yes. But specifically between ICE and the Holland Police Department, I do not have the authority nor the knowledge to answer that question at this time, but I can absolutely get an answer.
All right. We need to cut it off there,
Yeah.
but this is so interesting, and we just thank you so
Thank you.
much, Leah, for being here.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you.